Hi there, this is Dr. Austin Tay, and welcome to In Conversation. Today, we are very delighted to have Mr. James Morley Kirk from China Select to talk to us today. Hi, James. How are you?
Hi, Austin. Great, thank you.
So I'm very delighted to have you to share your expertise. Perhaps you could share with us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. British by birth, currently a practicing business psychologist at China Select. My sort of little career path has been circuitous from the British military through to international aviation, wending my way through China and the internet boom, and then into organizational psychology, which took me then back out to China to focus on leadership development and setting up China Select, which is a specialist talent assessment company set up in 2006 in Shanghai, which fortunately is still rocking and rolling. And that's what brings me here.
It's great to hear. And you being started from being in the army, then as you said, kind of transition to where you are becoming a psychologist. As a lot of organization psychologists, we all know a lot of the work that we do came somewhat from the military. Do you see there is a kind of similarity with what you encounter in the army and also what you practice as a business psychologist?
It's funny, actually. I was an army scholar, so I got into the military academy when I was like 16, but even then we had to go through a lot of assessments as young folk. And when I think back to some of the assessments, it's the first time I've done so for a long time. So an interesting question. Besides your academic progress and big reports from the school about your general character, there was everything from tests, paper and pencil, down to a testing center, to I remember at the military, a physical, of course, and at the military academy, really interesting, was a round of mini interviews in one large room, going from desk to desk around the side, being interviewed for about 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then moved to the next person, which is a multi-mini interview technique that I've never come across since. And also monster final interview with a panel of very important looking military folks and civilian staff on the other side of a very long wooden desk in a wood paneled room, and one little seat for you to sit on the other side of the desk to field their questions. Only minor intimidation going on. So yeah, it was a really interesting one. We didn't have psychometrics then that they do now, that's for sure. But it was a long process, and of course then lots of background checking they did as well, extensive background checking to vet you. So quite a process.
I cannot imagine going through that process myself. It must be so daunting at the age of 16 have to go through all that. Now you were saying
I don't think I even thought it was. It was just interesting. It was too young to know it was it was challenging.
Yeah, that's true. With your kind of experience in what you just shared with us, and then eventually going to this area of psychometrics, and then eventually having set up China Select. So what do you think has been kind of your learning as you've gone through your transition in your career and then eventually becoming a consultant, have your own consulting firm?
The experience in the military and in international aviation with the SWA group and Cathay Pacific, which took me around the world as well, living working wise. Even in the military, I lived in 3 countries. That wealth of experiences of different organizational contexts and cultures, the organizational national, I think is critical. And I always can go back to it into why I focus on talent assessment, for a couple of reasons. One, it's a real differentiator between organizational psychologists and consultants, is that we can assess, and it's the core of psychological practice, is that we know we can measure in some way the psychological constructs we're trying to influence for the good of individuals and society. So it's a fundamental thing that we can offer to society that's different. But one of the key memories of that probably pushed me down this path was in one of the organizations doing performance management appraisal. I was involved in a project to look at it, and the army and civil society have different approaches, which is very interesting and contrasting. And the approach that was being done was very sort of 80s US driven, very by numbers. Managers were sat back a long way and trying to manage people by data. And it was absolutely awful. From a leadership point of view, having come from a military leadership environment where we're very, very hands-on to the individual, knowing the individual intimately, always better than their parents, is what military leadership's about. To build up that trust and rapport as best you can, so that when you've got to use it without question, it can be exploited. But it's really important, and to come across the opposite, treating people by numbers and not as individuals. I felt you would sense that managers wanted to do it because it was easy for them to run their life that way, that managing people was messy. But when you start to quantify people, you can get into real abuse, not just mismanagement, but abuse. It's simply wrong if you're measuring people in the wrong way, because it affects, in those ways, at those times, it would affect their salaries, it would affect their training and development, it would affect their careers. So a single person's mismeasurement, based on often a lack of experience and understanding of who the person is, what they do, or how things are being measured, could have terrible consequences. So that's always been part of, for me, behind why it's so important that what we do is important. How we measure people, capability and potential is critical, and we need to fly that flag. Yes. So those experiences are very important to me, very important indeed. And besides measurement, general organizational culture and leadership practice, how to beat the military.
What is experience on leadership assessment and also understanding about organizational culture? Your many years of experience, what have you seen, has changed along these years as you're practicing as a practitioner in this area?
In terms of leadership, or?
Yes, in terms of leadership assessment, maybe let's start with that first.
Hard to say, really. I think the leadership area, in terms of leadership theories and therefore measurement of those theories, I think is quite circular, frankly. And there's a good sort of anecdote of that, or an observation some time ago, about how the focus of leadership changes depending on the economic cycle. So when the economic cycle is high, we focus on, academic researchers focus on individuals, leadership character, the great leader. Whatever way that's dressed up, it tends to be, the heroic leader, there he or she is, when things are great. When things are bad, when the economic cycle goes down, then we're looking at other forms of leadership, distributed leadership and humble leadership or whatever. So the idea, even this thing is, authentic service, humble leadership, that's been around before for a long time. Many times before in the past. Decades ago, these things were done. So I don't find that anything is particularly new. There's just a vogue, there's just a focus, and then literally within a generation, it all starts again, because people have forgotten. They forget the research, they forget history, frankly. It just seems to be the nature, and just some of it is retained. So I don't think, honestly, just the focus changes. I haven't seen anything new. I was very lucky talking with Julia Alba Metcalf the other day on their transformational leadership tool and the work that her mother had done. And they've got a wonderful assessment out at the moment. They've got a 360 and a self-rated. It's really interesting. There's nothing necessarily new about it. It's just an interesting focus to it on people, on the self-awareness and so on. Just a nice combination. In the right tools at the right time, it can help somebody become more aware and be nicely involved in leadership development. Yeah, no problem. Yeah. So yeah,
it's great to know. I mean, on the notion of tools, right? I mean, we are both kind of trained in the UK, so we know that a lot of times assessment tools are designed with a very different population. And as you just mentioned, you set up China Select in Shanghai. What were the things that you faced as you were trying to do assessment work, firstly in China, when you first set up? Was it difficult to be talking about assessment in China when you first set up?
Really interesting question. Something I haven't thought about for some time either. So thank you very much, Dr. Austin. Yeah, setting up in China was interesting then. Back in 2006, I remember the decisions to do so was very much in the practice I was in at that time. They were using leadership assessments. And they weren't really particularly well designed. And then I would look further into the industry, and all you come across is just horror of the assessment practices, the assessment tools being used around the whole industry in China. And there weren't that many international assessments there. SHL had struggled to get a traction. They set up offices, closed them down, and it was just problematic for lots of reasons at those times. International tools that hadn't been properly validated, local tools with no validity at all, and lots of pretty unfortunate, unpleasant practices where the employer was absolutely in charge and in power, and the applicants would be treated as cattle. And the main approach, especially to graduate hiring, was any assessment would do as long as it's long. And so, I mean, so we decided that it's time we can do better. We should do better for Chinese companies and employees and for society. Again, our aim as psychologists is to fairly measure and accurately measure an assessment of capability and potential, and to do so in a way that doesn't do harm in the actual process of doing so. So both in we could obviously contribute, and we set out then to solve that problem by firstly bringing in, we had to build up our skill sets too. So we worked with the supplier, Psychic International, to do that, who we still work with. And onto that validation route, oh my goodness, a year to validate the first tool, to develop it, multiple versions, to collect data, and to produce the technical manual to say, this works in China, it's fit for purpose. It took a year to do, and within that we had mental ability and personality, basically, but it was a year to get running. Lots and lots of challenges, attitude, value, even the valuing of an assessment, what people would be prepared to pay, the motivations of organizations for using them. Oh yeah, lots and lots of challenges, lots of challenges.
Do you think it has changed since you started in 2006 to now? Has it changed in China?
There's obviously, there's no doubt many things have changed. The industry has hugely expanded. It's a massive, the talent assessment in China is a massive industry. And now lots of local players dominate it, really. International players are all over there, but mainly through their international clients, frankly, rather than local. I think we've always focused on as China Select, we always go to market only first with our Chinese products, even if they have international heritages. So we always focus on serving China and Chinese people. So we bring in our international tools and local tools and our own tools we've created for the market. the market practices have improved, and yet at the same time, you know, and some of the technology produced locally in China is fabulous. Some of the new AI stuff they're trying, and the money around that. And yet at the same time, you will find many more examples of good practice now, that's for sure. And that's especially from international companies, but also from some local companies, even state-owned enterprises they have a particular center of excellence who really get it. They've got well-trained people, often all psych backgrounds, some of them trained overseas, and they're just wonderful to see because they really try and do it right. You know, following good practice, both psychometric and process, the tools, the process, and the competencies. And at the same time, you have just the horror stories that we had, you know, so many years ago. It just doesn't matter whether they're using blood type and horoscopes, or it doesn't matter what it is as long as it's long, or give us this. Why? No idea. We just need this. You know? So no reason for assessment, no job analysis, no validation. It doesn't matter. It's just so we can, rather than throwing dice, we can get rid of people.
Yeah.
It's all mystical, unfortunately. The best and the worst.
Yes, I think it's good to hear there is some progress within China, that people are taking assessment very seriously. Now, you mentioned earlier on about a local tool that you have actually designed with China Select. If I'm not wrong, it's called TD12.
Yes, yeah. TD12 actually is what we would always do is looking for new tools and new ways to assess that we can help bring into China or develop ourselves. There's always, you know, if you can help, you know. And the TD12 was something we picked up from Pearson assessments, actually it was created in France, and it's a dark side tool. At that time, Hogan, as you know, had their HDS very well established, and we looked at that. We felt at the time, very typical as well, is that it was very American centric. Its reliabilities weren't exactly impressive, although the reporting and the brand was super. But we felt we could do more, and we could do something perhaps even cheaper. And we found an alternative tool, which we then developed, and we've done that for about 10 years now. The dark side tool's very sensitive in terms of its the nature of the assessment, the interpretation of the assessment. So the validation was quite extensive, and it actually is really wonderful to do when you've got validation samples. We had samples from teachers, hospitals, the military, as well as criminal populations, as well as, of course, working populations too. So we got a really, really great insights from that. And yeah, that was really real great pleasure working on the TD12, and it remains for me one of the most interesting assessments, you know, I get to work with.
Yeah, well, that's great. I hope it continues to be successful as you're applying that in China.
Thank you.
Know, when we talk about assessment, right, we as outside, we always talk about what's the latest trend. And a couple of years ago, we were looking forward to a lot of gamification and AI and also VR. And earlier you were mentioning that China is quite on the forefront, actually, in terms of technology. Would that be something that China Select be looking at in terms of automating the way you are assessing people using some form of VR or AI?
It's a there's no simple answer to that, unfortunately, because when we're talking about AI, you know, it's a big topic that really needs unpacking in terms of what AI, how it's impacting assessment, and impacting assessment in China. What's for sure is the AI technology has definitely, it's not arrived, it's been in China actually for several years, if not longer. The investment is huge. The applications are, you know, from sourcing, helping source candidates better and faster. Obviously, internet sourcing, to screening applications, interview scheduling applications, chat bots, info bots, interview bots, to looking at ways to do ongoing analysis between performance profiles and selection profiles. So it's being applied everywhere. We ourselves in China Select, we are only a small consultancy, basically a boutique consultancy these days. We haven't found, funnily enough, actually a client asked us just yesterday or last week, was tell us about, give us an AI assessment, and we're going, well, what do you need to assess? Irrelevant. The issue with AI, as has been the issue from its very inception, hasn't really gone away, is that massive potential. It's driven by money, so because it's investment tech, it means it's got to be rolled out quickly. There needs to be a return on the investment. That's the nature of that sort of funding. So the cycle is in technology and marketing rather than technology and assessment validation. And you get this, PowerPoint first and validity second. And that's the challenge with it. It's not what it promises. It's not even what it's doing. It's whether we can actually know that it's doing good. So if it's beyond something that's just automating a process, you can see it's more efficient. If it's actually into psychological assessment, then the fundamentals don't change. And it doesn't matter what your tech is, you're going to have to demonstrate it. And that's the problem. Even us as specialists, if we ask these companies, they either the people who are trying to explain them can't explain, or they don't have the information available, or they won't provide it. It's just time out on, and they'll just find somebody to sell it to. Right. So that's the problem with it. Gamification is there. Gamification much less than before, basically. But just UIs that we're familiar with that evolves over our typical experiences of using new UI technology. They're just being put in. So you're getting new UIs. Not a lot of gamification, really. It didn't completely take off. But technology that allows simulations to happen, definitely there. VR hasn't taken off, but is still there on the fringes, and it's being used in training scenarios much more, which is really wonderful, simulating live skills. And last week, in a session with some in a US webinar I was on, some really good faith in that, whether it's augmented reality or extended reality, in addition to virtual reality, it's all just different bits of tech to try and make things more engaging, connecting with real life simulations in virtual environments. Great promise still, but little traction so far. And the companies that are using these things really are only the wafer thin layer of large companies. It's no way down to small, medium enterprises, and don't expect it anytime soon. So these things are still there, but definitely part of the trend. That's where money is pouring into. Will they see a return on their investment very shortly? I doubt it.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that as oxides, right, we are always looking forward to see what's next, and sometimes things just don't evolve as they promise, as you said earlier on about gamification kind of died off from there. Now on the note that you were talking about the trends, you being the expert in the space, I would like to ask you, what do you foresee in terms of the next few years from now? What would be the trend in terms of the assessment space?
Yeah, I definitely can't say a few years from now, because at the rate of change at the moment, social, economic, political, goodness knows what the world's going to be looking like.
Yes.
Certainly what it looks like for the next year, or at least the foreseeable flavors that the industry folks are talking about, and what we're seeing. I'm now currently based in the UK during this pandemic time, so it's allowed me actually to have a broader view of the world, more connected with Europe and the US, which has been really positive, frankly. So I can definitely share you sort of some themes coming up, sort of 8, 9, 10 that I've just looked at. So putting aside, just assuming that we understand that, there's a lot of social economic upheaval at the moment and change, moving to this digitalization of life and work, movement away from traditional organizations, digital economy, gig economies, temporary work. So a lot of changes, but it has meant that obviously the technical side is boomed. So we've seen massive investment in talent assessment and talent acquisition tech. That's just going to continue. This companies that you would never have expected a few years back going IPO, they're talent assessment companies. Extraordinary. So huge money going into these things. That's going to continue. Jobs boards have boomed and been invested in, as well as all the AI tech. Aggressive marketing, therefore, will remain. So quite some Alice in Wonderland stuff in terms of marketing. That lovely quote I always like is, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast, is what Alice says in Wonderland. And I think we have to be wary of that. So with that mass investment becomes 2 rapid rollouts, but fascinating. So just always be aware of PowerPoint before proof. That trend will remain as long as talent assessment investment is breakneck speed, because the investment requires a return. And that's where capitalism conflicts with psychology. Definitely there's sort of tech that's in demand. It's on the acquisition side rather than the assessment side. And that's something I'll pick up on just briefly at the end as well, if I can. The technology that's really in demand is still on efficiencies. So that's with, applicant shortages at the moment, the focus on sourcing solutions. How do we find more applicants faster? Can AI find it for us? So AI is really working hard on that. Big, fast internet, scraping and solutions to bring applicants into into various talent pools, make them available, communicating with. So AI is doing a lot of that. Tech's doing a lot of that. Filtering solutions, so sort of early screening solutions. Again, lots more tech with that as well. You're going to see what filtering means, though, in talent assessment terms for the industry is really quite a varied feast. Often it's just a chat bot asking them basic questions and then booking them an interview. Because still the majority of assessment programs, amazingly, it's CV or equivalent. There's plenty of campaigns against the CV at the moment for bias and non-effective, non-valid reasons, which is not a bad thing. But then it's still trying to filter out people, screen people out, and then just book them an interview with a recruiter. That's still fundamentally the assessment program of today for the majority of companies. Psychometrics, I think, is still not used enough. And so when I'm looking at tech advances, we're seeing advances in efficiency and candidate experience, making things more customized. And AI and mass customizations of the experience is definitely going to be there for sure. But the assessment part, not a lot. There is still lots of matching going on, and some on how that's done is varied, but that's not really what sells. And I don't see that there will be some improvements for sure. And with data linking up is going to help validation. That's been the promise for many years. Maybe next year it will, but that's not where the tech investment's going. It's still on efficiency and experience stuff, better sourcing, quick filtering into the interview. AI customization at scale, I mentioned, definitely is going to happen, I think, next year. So customized communications, customized assessment, customized feedback, that's going to be there. How really deep that's going to be, I doubt very much, but the potential is there, and that's not a bad thing, because it allows us actually to do that whole element, the way we communicate, the way we assess, the way we give feedback. That's not a bad thing. So I think we're going to see more of that creeping in, AI customization at scale. One thing that's definitely around at the moment, and we talked about last week by Intel and the Autodesk folks, is this focus on skills. So the logic is that because we don't have enough experienced candidates to fill the jobs we want, how do we fill them? We're going to either have to hire from within and train up, or we'll hire from without and train up. So the focus on skills is, if we know what the skills, define the jobs in terms of skills, then we can find people with skills that are either lower down on the skills, but we can train up, we just extrapolate that and add to those. And that's going to be an easier way to do it, and to hell with the experience bit, because you don't have it. So this talk about skills typologies, skills libraries, skills mapping is big at the moment. I don't know if that's the real solution, but that's a thing. It's a good thing to have, but frankly, we were doing skills taxonomies, and if you're doing good job evaluation, you've got good job libraries, if you like, you've done skills stuff anyway. But that's just where they're looking, because can't work with the CV, no one's got the experience, let's just work on training and offer to train them up. So skills-based, transferable skills. As long as you've got skills, who cares about what your job title's been or where you come from? That's all that matters. I think is myopic, but that's what the flavor is. Skills taxonomies you'll see a lot more of, I think, next year, hiring for skills. There's still stuff around hiring for soft skills that you'll see. That's still going to be around. Unfortunately, I think in reality, when I looked at Psychometrics the other day, who are doing a big push on it, they've got the solution for skills. It's actually personalities when they're talking about it. So scratch head, it's marketing stuff. Be aware, once again, what you're actually assessing and how it's being assessed. Those things don't go away. Another big thing, I got a couple of more things for you. VR, AR, ER, we talked about already. So more simulations, more work samples. Definitely, that should be coming in recruitment and training. With that as well, rather than the gamification bit, I'd say more realistic job previews. That's really important. And a lot of that is employee-generated content being put out to show the authentic side of the business by the businesses. So not just by Glassdoor, but by businesses showing this is what the real job is. And we know that RJPs are critical for self-selection. It's one of the cheapest assessment tools there is. It just gets people to opt in or opt out by informing them fully what it is they're going into. And so there's a lot of easy wins on RJPs that seems to be quite encouraged now by showing the authentic side of businesses. So we're going to see that more. Final thing on the big stuff, I think, is, or maybe not the final thing, is digitalization and bias. Digitalization of interviews. The interview is still the absolute thing, unfortunately, because in terms of judgment, humans are bad at it, especially if they're not trained. We know that trained org psychs always produce higher validity using structured interview techniques than anybody else does. Why? Because they're competent. Right. But most interviewers are simply not trained. That's just not their approach. And there's lots of things to talk about as to why that is, given the centrality of the interview. What we're getting, though, is the impact of AI and technology on interviews, not just scheduling or doing mini, how old are you, whatever it is, or how many years experience have you had in sales, that sort of chatbot-y interviews, but in actually asking the questions, passing the responses through natural language processing, and producing the next question and then evaluating. And that in China, actually last year, I remember coming across a company whose their ambition was to produce interviews as valid as human interviews. Now, in truth, that bar is not very high. But if they can do so, then you can get rid of human interviews, at least certain processes. That in itself is good, because the more that AI can ask standardized questions, can pass answers and probe, can record and analyze the responses into whether competencies, outcomes or otherwise. Once the evidence has been collected, it's just the same as an interviewer writing down everything and going through an ORCE, behavioral analysis, content analysis. No difference at all, except the human bias, layers of bias are not there. It's just what was said, not how it was said, just what was said. So pure content analysis can produce outcomes and that a human person can do. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Also, interview intelligence, which is a really easy win. It's already happening. Taking sales programs and written for sales analysis of what is a good sales call look like, what does a good salesperson do, and analyzing what interviewers are doing. Because a lot of interviews, of course, now are held online, which means they're recordable, analyzable, and trackable in terms of success rates of the people there, or the recommendations they're making, and the successes of the future employees. So that recruiter analytics, actually analyzing what they're doing and what they're not doing, that's really wonderful too, because that will start to hold recruiters and interviewers accountable. And we'll be able to train them up to become better interviewers and maybe one day beat AI.
Yeah.
The digitalization of interviews is going to be a really, really positive thing, I think. Actually unfortunately, taking away some of the power of the interviewers, but making them potentially much more valid. Final thing I would say is about bias. So the last year or so, for very good reason and not without and not overdue, this focus on bias in assessment, and bias in general, but bias, of course, in the selection process. In terms, the bias discussion has been very much on diversity, equality, and inclusion, rather than bias. See, bias is a much bigger issue about measurement error rather than about social equality.
Yes.
So the focus of bias discussion about it is simply been, for me, on equality issues. And that's not psychometrically what I'm interested in. We're worried about adverse impact, and that's been in place for many years in law. So no change there at all. If it's focused people on doing so and why they're biased, focus on actually making those evaluations, that's great news. Great news. Finally, but that's after decades of it being in law and psychologists recommending best practice. So one has to then take that as an example of, we can have best practice in psychometrics, but humans don't care unless they're held accountable, or society, politically, or whatever. So that's a really interesting thing. The bias that I hope we can get to is the focus on error, an error of judgment, because it's honestly not the bias of what color your skin is, what age or orientation you've got, that matters to business in the day. It matters about whether the right person is getting the job that they can do and whatever. That's what we're about, is about matching capability and potential to the right, in a fair way. Fair opportunity to perform, respectful process, equal opportunities to get that position. And the error that we know exists in recruiter judgment and in the recruitment process is extraordinary. It's terrible. That's why I often laugh when we think about use this, use that tool, a better validity of whatever point this, point that, because the error introduced in the process by the humans who run it is at a quantumly greater level than any error in the psychometric tools that are used. And yet they will dither about the validity of a psychometric instrument. Oh my God, ridiculous. Process bias. And that's especially at interview, the poor quality of judgment through the interviewing teams, recruiting teams, is the problem. That's where our focus of bias needs to be. That's probably not a prediction, that's more my wish list. And the final thing on my wish list, if I can finish my monologue, is talent assessment against talent acquisition. The money has poured into talent acquisition this year. talent acquisition is recruitment, yeah, sourcing and putting people into vacancies. I have focused and looked at a lot of talent acquisition more than ever this year in my whole professional life. And it's a fascinating thing because talent acquisition is seen, I think, now as a bit of a hold all for everything in recruitment. And yet you can look at content of talent acquisition conferences, talent acquisition newsletters, talent acquisition webinars. The element of assessment in that conversation is tiny. It's a tiny element compared to sourcing and experience and speed to hire. Assessment is almost never there. Competency of assessment, assessment practices, assessment tools, never discussed. And what I hope, again, it's a wish list. It is nearly Christmas, isn't it?
Yes.
Is that talent assessment starts to stand out and beyond talent acquisition, such that we first have to shout against it in order to then be merged back where as it should be. It can't be recruiters against assessors. And at the moment, recruiters are the assessors. But the assessment piece really is a poor child compared to the sourcing, fast screening, put people on seats bit of talent acquisition. And from obviously a psychological, psychometric point of view, that's just all wrong. That's not serving society as we should do. We need to rebalance that and follow folks like Kahneman and their great work on noise, and make sure that talent assessment is a very big part of the talent acquisition story, and talent acquisition managers, or that equation of effectiveness, efficiency, and experience, effectiveness, quality of hire, including all the bias and diversity stuff, is the poor child, and that's not right. It must be an absolutely equal part, if not the most important, at the table when you're hiring people or developing people.
Yeah,
and that will be about it.
Well, thank you very much. Those were very concise and a very long list there. I'm sure, and some, as you said, some of the things are circular and things will remain as it is, whereas we all know what they are. And I totally agree with you about the talent acquisition piece. I've always been advocating assessment is very important in the initial stage of talent acquisition. And we can only hope that things will change. With that, I must say thank you very much for sharing your insights and thoughts with us. I'm sure this is going to be very useful for our listeners and those who are watching also in this video here. If there is one advice that you can give to maybe students who are wanting to become organizational psychologists, what would be that advice that you give them?
To become an organizational psychologist, organizational psychology is in many countries a protected field, and yet there are areas underneath it. As I myself am not a chartered psychologist, but like yourself, I have stayed as a business psychologist and applying my trade that way. But I'm a member of the British Psychological Society, an associate fellow of the British Psychological Society. So the route to organizational psychology is very much through universities and membership of the societal bodies in your national area. And you need to research that first, so you're going to follow the right route. It's not necessarily the only route to getting into the area that organizational psychologists deal with, and you can build up all the skill sets and competencies without going to university, frankly. Everything that is done at university is something that is read, is something that is learned. You can learn online in libraries or otherwise. There's different ways to acquire it. But the presence of it, the organizational, the support of the profession, that umbrella that is given, is only really acquired if you go through those professional steps. That's university, that's into societies, supervised practice. So depends how you want to contribute, and if you like, what uniform you want to present to society as to who you are and what you can do. Definitely there are more flexible routes these days, and it's wonderful to see that those are evolving. And there's all the societies, like the Hong Kong Psychological Society can support and advise. I think we're much more aware of careers these days and bringing on young psychologists early. So if anybody's interested in psychology, organizational psychology, business psychology, you've only got to reach out to your local society. There'll be a careers person or just anybody like yourself, myself. And I was always willing to talk and advise. There are mentorship programs going on at the moment internationally that I'm part of, where master's students, are being helped because there's no job opportunity at the moment. They're a bit lost. So the industry is reaching out, professionals reaching out to help the next wave. So very, very positive, I think, at the moment. If you're interested, all you have to do is ask universities or career centers or the psychological societies, and there's so much desire to help and guide, and more routes to competency. So very, very good days, frankly, for org psychs. It's a growth occupation because of what we bring in terms of scientific grounding, a scientific approach, that evidence-based practice, the analytics and stats parts to it. We are everything that organizations would need in terms of the talent piece. Org psychs bring in the modern way.
Yes.
Very, very fit for purpose, frankly, right now.
Great. Well, with that, I'm going to say thank you very much again, James, for talking to me in this episode of In Conversation. And
thank you.
I'm sure all our viewers will be enjoying what's been shared today. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Austin.